Hello, Year 6. I am going to be reading the next part of our class reader, Dead Man's Cove. I am going to be starting on chapter 4. So if you haven't heard the rest of the story, I would suggest going back to our YouTube channel and watching from the beginning or from the chapter that you haven't heard yet. Right, let's find out what's happened to Laura now. More like a ghost than a boy, I sometimes think, Mrs. Crabtree told Laura a little over a week later. Hardly surprising the way Mr. Mukhtar has him working all hours the Lord sends in that shop. Free labour is what he is. Should be in school or throwing a frisbee on the beach, in my opinion, but Mr. Mukhtar says he's being homeschooled by Mrs. Mukhtar. Goodness knows how she finds the time. Whenever I pass Hair Today, Gone Tomorrow, she's in there getting a coconut oil treatment or extensions or whatever it is the trendy people do these days. Mrs. Crabtree lived at number 30 Ocean View Terrace. It was her curtains that twitched whenever Laura left the house. Though in her 60s, she was as fashion conscious as a shopkeeper's wife, bleaching her hair blonde and dressing exclusively in shades of pink, purple and orange. No point in growing old gracefully when you can do it disgracefully, she liked to tell people. She cornered Laura on her way back from St. Ives Primary School, which Laura had been attending for nearly a fortnight, with the words, "Back from the dead, so I hear." Laura stifled a giggle. "No, just back from school." Mrs. Crabtree found this hilarious. "You mustn't mind my turn of phrase," she said when she had recovered. "I only mean that your uncle was unaware that you existed all these years, and yet here you are, pretty as a picture. Not every enigma at number 28 is so easily solved, let me tell you." Laura put her bag down on the ground and wrapped her scarf more tightly around her neck to shut out the cold wind. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Crabtree laughed again. "Oh dear, there's my mouth running away with me again. What marvellous colouring you have. Such wonderfully creamy skin and hair like sun-bleached wheat. You'll tan up a treat in the summer. How are you settling in with your uncle? I've been away on holiday, so I would have stopped in to welcome you to St. Ives sooner. I don't mind telling you we were all agog when we found Calvin Redfern had an 11-year-old niece living with him. What with him being practically a recluse, and as for that housekeeper, well..." She made a dismissive gesture with her purple mittens. "But what do I know? Anyway, how are you finding it?" "I love it," Laura said loyally. "School is okay. I'm still getting used to it. There's one very annoying boy in my class, but I just ignore him. As for my uncle, he and I have a great time together, and Mrs. Webb is a fantastic cook. She bakes the world's best Victoria sponge cake." She didn't mention that Mrs. Webb had not improved on acquaintance and alternated between fake friendliness and a sullen silence. Laura kept out of her way as much as possible. Mrs. Crabtree's golden curls quivered with disappointment at the news. "Well," she said, "I'm pleased to hear it. No doubt it will be nice for your uncle to have a bit of company after all this time." "All what time?" A giant seagull landed on the stone wall surrounding Mrs. Crabtree's garden, and she ran at it like a crazed flamingo, arms flapping. "These wretched gulls get bigger, noisier and greedier every year," she complained. "It won't be Olga Crabtree who's surprised the day one carries off a small child. Now, where was I?" "You were saying that it's nice for my uncle to have a bit of company. Has he been alone for long?" "Well," said Mrs. Crabtree, "I don't know about all that. All I know is that he arrived here in the dead of night nearly a year ago, wide-eyed and dishevelled. By chance I was looking out of the window at the time. He'd driven down from some place in the north, Aberdeen, Scotland, people say. But he doesn't have the accent." She winked. "You'll have to ask him and pass it on." Laura, who felt a bit uncomfortable discussing her uncle with a perfect stranger, was about to retort that under no circumstances would she be doing anything of the kind when she remembered that Matt Walker often found village gossips to be an extremely useful asset to his investigations. For every 10 pieces of misinformation they passed on, there was the occasional gem. She murmured vaguely. Mrs. Crabtree was shaking her head at the memory. Would you believe your uncle rented number 28 sight unseen and fully furnished, right down to the pictures? That's what the estate agent told me. And from what I've witnessed when I've had the occasional call on him, nothing's changed since. What? Not even the pictures? Said Laura, thinking of the ugly seascape in her bedroom. Mrs. Crabtree gave a triumphant smile. Not even the pictures. Apart from the books and now yourself, it's as if it was freeze-framed the day he walked in. Laura had been telling the truth when she informed Mrs. Crabtree that she loved living with her uncle and had a great time with him. What she hadn't mentioned was that her uncle had as many moods as the sea, and that those great times were few and far between. They were 5 minutes here or the occasional meal there. He was unfailingly kind to her, that could not be argued. He saw to it that she wanted for nothing, not that Laura asked for much. When he did focus on her, as he did when he escorted her to the gate on her first day of school, presenting her with a lunchbox full of treats to help her through it, or on one magical morning when they went for a dawn walk on Porthmere Beach together, and he asked her to tell him stories of Sylvan Meadows, and related some of his favourite childhood stories about her mother, she felt a strong feeling of kinship towards him, as though he were her father rather than her uncle. He was different from every other grown-up she had ever met. He had a different way of thinking. When Laura had nervously confessed that she had taken herself out for breakfast with the money he'd given her, he'd replied, "Did you really? On your first morning in St. Ives? That takes guts." He said no more about it, but she sensed that by doing something that required a degree of courage, even something as small as going out for a meal by herself, she'd earned his respect. But he was rarely home. He worked long hours and odd hours. Laura saw more of Mrs. Webb, which was not something she'd have done out of choice. Once Laura went down at 3 a.m. to get a glass of water and noticed that Calvin Redfern's bed had not been slept in. When she asked him about it the next day, he laughed and said something about being overworked and underpaid. Even when he was at home, he might as well have not have been there for the hours he spent in his study. On a couple of occasions, Laura had come across him sitting in the darkened living room with a book open on his knee, staring out of the window with an expression so haunted she'd had to restrain herself from rushing to throw her arms around him. After her conversation with Mrs. Crabtree, Laura had thought a lot about her neighbour's description of Calvin Redfern's arrival in St. Ives just a year before. In the dead of night and looking wild-eyed and dishevelled. Even allowing for the fact that Mrs. Crabtree was, in all likelihood, prone to exaggeration, it did make her curious. What was her uncle running from? Was he running at all? Laura's imagination, always fertile, went to town on the possibilities. She had a different theory for every day of the week. One day she had decided he was a master criminal who'd staged the biggest heist in Britain and was waiting for the fuss to die down so that he could start selling off his gold ingots. The next she had persuaded herself that he'd abandoned his wife, or that his wife had run off with another man, and that he'd moved to St. Ives to get over his broken heart, or to help her get over hers. Not that she knew whether he'd actually had a wife or not. What she had hoped to discover was that he was an MI5 spy or an SAS commando gone AWOL. But the chances were that Mrs. Crabtree had an imagination as overactive as her own. In all likelihood, her uncle really had come to Cornwall to work for the fisheries department, as he claimed. He was innocent. His move to St. Ives was innocent, and he'd merely been weary from the long drive of the evening he'd got to town. Of course, that didn't answer the question of why he'd rented a house full of someone else's furniture and pictures and never changed any of it. However, Matron had often talked to Laura about the hopelessness of men when it came to decorating or keeping a house, so maybe it was simply that. The obvious thing would have been to ask her uncle directly, but the first time she'd tried, he'd looked at his watch, put a lead on Lottie, and said with a sad smile, "There's a saying. Yesterday is history. Tomorrow is a mystery. Let's enjoy today, eh, Laura?" And Laura, who loved her new life in St. Ives, and was already quite fond of her uncle, in spite of his eccentricities, was inclined to agree. So that was chapter 4 of Dead Man's Cove. I hope you enjoyed it. Her uncle certainly is mysterious, isn't he? What on earth do you think he does? She's certainly come up with a lot of possibilities for his job. What do you think he might do? Or do you think there's another reason that he doesn't sleep in his bed, or that he works all hours of the day and night? I certainly think it's strange that he sits in his darkened living room with a haunted expression on his face. In chapter 2, he also had a strange expression on his face, don't you remember? I wonder what's causing that. We'd love to hear your ideas and your thoughts on the story so far. So you can email us or you can share your ideas in our assembly. Keep your eyes peeled on the YouTube channels to see the next chapters of the story being read.